So I make movies for a living, which means my job is basically storytelling. And if you're not a storyteller, that's fine. The more you know about the process and the issues, some of the issues behind storytelling, the more tools you'll have to appreciate movies. So you can consider this as a film appreciation talk, particularly one that's kind of focused around films that deviate from the norm or that are kind of controversial. And it kind of helps to talk about it from time to time, in my case, because films like General Luna and its intended sequels are not your straightforward historical movies. They kind of weave in and out of fiction and use facts. It kind of rearranges facts to suit a particular theme. Okay. Now, earlier this year, a certain professor tweeted that because I made a film about Antonio Luna, who was definitely an authoritarian, and that I intend to make a film about Manuel Quezon, who according to him was proto-authoritarian, the implication was that I might make movies that glorify dictators in the future. And I was like, what? Pero, pero yun. The thing is, I disagreed with him, but just a quick background. 2015, I made General Luna, which is about Antonio Luna. And then this year, we're going to release its sequel about Gregorio del Pilar, who's being played by Paolo Avellino. Abangan niyo yung teaser next week, lalabas na siya online. And then, if this film is successful, we move on to Manuel Quezon. Okay, now, I wrote an essay in response to that professor's tweet. Ito yung title. But then, the professor wrote an essay in response to my essay. Yan yung title. Cute, di ba? So, you can just Google it if you want because it's an interesting exchange. You might know more about yung dialogue between films and their critics. Having people interpret my work in different ways and criticize my work, sometimes with hostility, it comes with the job. But thankfully, a lot of people understood General Luna's themes, intended themes. But this brings us to my topic today. Given that a story can be interpreted in many ways, does the storyteller hold a responsibility towards the audience to make himself clear, relatable, or to make works that are not offensive? Or should the storyteller have a moral responsibility towards the audience? So before I answer those questions, we're going to take a short detour. The author is dead. This is a very influential idea in literary criticism and theory that basically says, in a nutshell, that the meaning of a certain narrative or a story resides in the reader's response to it or the interpretation. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have seen Black Panther. On the surface, the story is about a man who inherits the tainted legacy of his father's kingdom and about the other guy who challenges the throne, fueled by his righteous anger. Yun yung obvious na kwento. But then, you have this reading. Black Panther is a deeply evil film. It dangles the idea of global black liberation in front of you. And this is by an African American, okay? So it's an entirely different reading of the film. Or you consider the film Titanic. On the surface, it's obviously a love story about an underprivileged young man and a rich but repressed girl. But then you have an article online that makes believable points about Titanic actually being a lesbian love story. Meaning, the character that Leonardo DiCaprio is playing is actually lesbian. Now, yeah, what? Ganun din eh. If the author is dead, all of the intended themes of the author and the narrative arcs don't matter as much as your own interpretation of the story. So you can say that Black Panther is an evil film, you can say that Titanic is a lesbian love story, and you can definitely say that General Luna promotes authoritarianism. That's fine. But the question is, if the author is dead, what happens if we're talking about communication and storytelling? How does it help to kill the author if we're trying to make meaningful connections between people using stories as agents in society? Okay? So, now we've established that the author's intentions are still important. And now we can ask, why are stories important? Because frankly, we can't help but think in stories. Thinking in stories is a byproduct of our evolution as a species. The current consensus in evolutionary psychology right now is that our brains are hardwired to over-detect agency. Meaning, If some random thing happens, you always think that there's a conscious being behind this event. Bigyan ko yung examples. You're sleeping and then you wake up in the middle of the night because you heard something, may noise outside your room. What you automatically think is intruder, or worse, multo. Diba? What you don't think is random gravity, may nalaglag lang. Or for example, you're in some grassy area, may kumaluskus dun sa grass, may gumalaw, and then what you automatically think is snake. You don't think hangin lang siya. Okay? Or for example, one day you say to yourself, gusto kong gawin tong bagay nito. I want to do this thing, but I need a sign if I'm going to do it. And then you go out of your house, the first thing you see is a billboard by Nike that says, just do it. And then you go, thank you, universe, thank you for the sign. Okay. Without even realizing that that billboard has always been there and it doesn't really care about your feelings because wala naman siyang feelings in the first place. But suddenly, the universe becomes a conscious agent that conspires to give you personally a sign because you asked for it. Lakas mo sa universe, di ba? Now, consider this animation. It's about mga roughly 30 seconds and silent. Check out the big triangle and the little triangle and the dot. Yan na siya. Hello. Okay. Obviously, may kwento siya, di ba? The traditional interpretation is that this big guy, the big triangle, is being aggressive towards the little triangle, the little guy, and then he decides to go after the girl who's trapped inside the box. So merong conflict, there's suspense, there's even gender. What we're not thinking is that these are just two triangles and a circle moving around in white space. But we can't help but see the story that's happening in it. Kasi naka-hardwire yung utak natin for a story. So our ancestors survived in the wild because of this agent detection. And we also thrived because we had ancestors who could figure out the intentions and the desires of their neighbors and use that to create cooperative societies and civilizations, or what scientists call the theory of mind. Take these two together, and it's not hard to imagine why we can't help but think in stories. Okay, so having said all of those things, now we can ask, does the storyteller have a responsibility? Do I have a responsibility to you to make my work relatable or non-offensive or nice or clear? The answer is no. Okay. Storytellers have a free pass on some things because it's a prerequisite for creativity. Some artists need to explore, to experiment. Sometimes these experiments are so unfamiliar that it becomes very difficult for them to connect to the audience. But that's just the natural state of the experimenter, or what's known as the avant-garde. But what's great about this is that sometimes these experiments are able to connect to other artists. And these other artists are able to translate these experiments into forms that more people will appreciate. Now consider the works of these two artists. John Whitney and si Jordan Belson, these are from the 1960s, and these are abstract works. Not too many people know about them, but their works were the inspiration for the Stargate sequence in 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, 2001: A Space Odyssey is pretty much the influence for every sci-fi film you see today, from Star Wars to Star Trek, maybe even Avengers, who knows. Yun. Now, embedded in this freedom to experiment and explore is the freedom to criticize and offend. There's a lot of talk online about people being offended by this and that. But I say we should be still free to be offensive, because sometimes that's the only way we can arrive at certain objective truths. And not all truths are convenient. Some are harsh. And no revolution was ever started by being polite. So if ever there's a storyteller out there who plans to go into potentially offensive territory for the sake of exploration and art, you can forget about the feelings of your audience. But remember to be fair. Don't be mean-spirited. Okay, storytellers need the freedom to present an idea that may contain both positive and negative qualities. In General Luna, knowing that our country has a long, long history of electing strongmen, there was an element of danger in making a film about an authoritarian, but there were a lot of themes that were worth talking about in the movie, so we went ahead and did it anyway. Now, I also made Bliss, starring Isa Calzado. It was rated X by the MTRCB during the first pass for nudity and violence. Sabi sa akin ng MTRCB, sila mismo, they're not offended by the film, but they're concerned about the conservative people who might be offended by it, which I found kind of strange because why would the government body protect the feelings of a conservative group of people while denying the more liberal-minded Filipinos a fair chance to see the movie? Pare-pareho lang naman taxpayers yung mga yan, di ba? So it was kind of unconstitutional. But I knew the risks when I wrote the script, but we went and did it anyway because it's important to expand the boundaries of what adults are allowed to see in cinemas. Now, having said all of these things, we can ask, should the storyteller have a moral responsibility towards the audience? Now, the answer is, of course, yes. But for this one, I bring up one of my heroes, si Martin Scorsese. Si Lola Martin has been making movies since the 1960s. Yan. And some of his most popular movies feature protagonists that are, in the usual sense, bad guys. They are insecure, they are immoral, they are violent, they are greedy, they are corrupt. And usually in these movies, the bad guys get away with it. But does this mean that Scorsese is glorifying these criminals, as what some articles would say? Is he endorsing their behavior? Not necessarily, because usually when a storyteller writes a story, one of the first things that he or she does is choose a point of view. Now, this choice of point of view is what's confusing for some people. For example, if I decide to write a story about a true-to-life female psychopath, now this girl is not a psychopath, okay? She's an actress playing a psychopath in my film, Bliss. If I decide to tell the story from her point of view, I'm going to use all of my storytelling tools to make sure you know what her experience is like. In her mind, the crimes she's committing are not crimes. She may even take pleasure from them and feel no remorse at all. And this makes it uncomfortable for the audience because not all of us are psychopaths, at least I hope so. Okay? But we have to stay true to her point of view. And this decision to stay true to her point of view, it does not necessarily mean that I'm endorsing her emotions, even her actions, even though it might appear as such, especially if you're the kind of audience who would like to see justice served every time in your movies. Now, my point of view can shift from hers to mine. I can take it towards truth and fiction. This is one of the freedoms of the storyteller, and it all depends on my agenda or my bias. But a story doesn't always require a moral lesson. Good stories will let you, the audience, decide what's right and what's wrong. And a lot of good stories will often raise questions instead of give you straight answers. Okay. Now this desire to see happy endings and justice served in our movies could be an offshoot of what psychologists call the just world fallacy. We need to see that the world is fair and that people get what they deserve. But in reality, things are so random and a lot of evil goes unpunished and a lot of good goes unrewarded. And we can't but we can't process this randomness, so it becomes necessary for us to believe in things like karma or to impose systems in society that ensure a degree of fairness, which is why we have laws. But also, this is one of the reasons why it's frustrating pag walang happy ending dun sa pelikula, di ba? So, one final thing about Lola Martin. 1972, US presidential candidate George Wallace survived an assassination attempt by Arthur Bremer. And then in the case of art imitating life, that event becomes the inspiration for one of his movies, Taxi Driver, one of my favorite movies. In this film, the character Travis Bickle is so lonely and depressed that he becomes obsessed about saving a child prostitute played by Jodie Foster. But things don't go as planned. Hindi spoiler to. Things don't go as planned, and he ends up trying to assassinate a presidential candidate. Now, in a case of life imitating art, 1981, John Hinckley Jr. becomes obsessed with Jodie Foster after seeing Taxi Driver. He tries to make her fall in love with him. It doesn't happen. What does he do? He tries to assassinate Ronald Reagan. So we come full circle, di ba? Now, stories can definitely be triggers. There's no denying that. And it's very easy to blame a controversial work of art for influencing immoral behavior. But I think it's even more immoral to police art just because we're afraid that it might be a bad influence on someone. I think bad people will do bad things regardless. And the moment we deny artists the freedom to make something offensive is the moment we deny ourselves the breadth of human experience. The only time we should censor art is when it is an explicit call to violence or when it directly harms someone. Okay? Now, I know the situation is different, but the principle is kind of the same. If you blame a woman for wearing the wrong kind of clothes and getting physically harassed by it, a woman can wear whatever she wants. A man may or may not be affected by it, but what matters is what the man does with his trigger. It's what he does. It's his actions that matter in the end. Okay, so in a free society such as ours, you don't police women's clothing, you don't police art. Okay, so for the casual moviegoers out there, I encourage you to be more adventurous in your movie-going habits. Films are definitely entertainment, but they can also open up areas of human experience that are more profound than just good guys winning over bad guys or the happily ever afters. If there are storytellers out there, please, by all means, explore, experiment, criticize, be offensive, but remember to be fair, don't be mean. In the case of the historical trilogy we're trying to complete, the idea is to look into a version of the past to see how we were back then at the risk of offending people, including historians, so that we may compare it to how we are right now in the hopes that somebody out there can figure out how we can proceed. Okay? Because stories contribute a lot to the formation of our personal and collective identity. In the same way that your own identity is a sum of your experience, your present state of mind, your hopes and aspirations, stories also function in the same way. As experience, as collective memory, as simulation, as aspiration, as representation. They tell us who we were. They tell us who we are right now, the best and the worst of us. Some movies tell us where we don't want to go. And often, the best movies tell us where we should go. Maraming salamat.